Alright, welcome to another video by The Science of Flight. This video is part of our Xfoil series dedicated to the Xfoil software. And in this video, we're going to do a brief overview of Xfoil and look at the data flow that happens between the different pieces of Xfoil. Let's get to it. This video is designed to be a top level, big picture, general overview of Xfoil, the pieces that make up Xfoil, and kind of how the pieces interact with each other. The idea is that if you're trying to use Xfoil to do a particular task, it will be easier and you'll understand what's happening a lot better if you understand the pieces that make up Xfoil, how they interact with each other. So that's kind of the idea behind this video, to give you that general big picture view of what's going on. Of course, this can sometimes be very hard to get because this big picture view, I should say, can sometimes be very hard to get because Xfoil is actually a command line prompt software as opposed to a graphical user interface software. A lot of times with GUI programs, when you're performing different routines, you can kind of see some of the other options available to you and the different buttons on the command, on the ribbon, and in the different menus. So sometimes you can get a better picture of the software on a GUI just using it. Whereas with a command line prompt, oftentimes if you're not querying, what commands are available in different menus, kind of reading through them, it's not as obvious. So that's kind of the idea behind this video. So we'll just start off with the four, I guess these are kind of what I consider the four basic pieces of Xfoil. And if you look at it, it's pretty much, you can kind of categorize these four into two different types of objects. You got memory types of objects and you got like code types of objects, which makes sense. I mean, this is software, it's just using code to work on memory, but that's, subject of a different video. All right, so let's go over these four. The local memory. So a lot of times when you start Xfoil, you're going to have to load in an airfoil that you want to work with, and you're loading it into kind of the local memory, the memory you're using right then as you run it, right? And this is the memory that if you close out of Xfoil, it's not going to be saved anywhere. You're going to have to either reload something into this memory, or you're going to have to rerun an analysis to be able to regenerate some of this info, the information or data that could be in this memory. So some of the stuff is, there's kind of like buffers that holds different data that you can use commands to work on. So that's kind of the idea behind it, is that you can load data into the local memory and then use commands to either tweak it or do an analysis on it. The other type of memory is going to be stored files. So Xfoil has some built-in functionality of loading NACA airfoils, but sometimes you might want to load your own custom airfoil in there, or an airfoil you found in a different database. So that'd be that would be an instance where you might be using a stored file to load data into the local memory. So for instance, these would be the files that you would have located on your computer somewhere on your desktop in a folder. Those are your stored files, and they could be airfoil coordinates or drag polars that you saved after you run an analysis. So that's kind of some of the stored files you can do. All right, then in terms of the code portion of Xfoil, it's built into a hierarchy of menus, and each of those menus have a list of commands that you can do while you're in that menu. I'm calling them menus, but Xfoil, a lot of the documentation calls them routines. I think this is just due to the fact that, if you're wanting to design the geometry of the airfoil, you might run through a particular routine to do that. So that's, the menu is the menu that contains all the commands would be the routine to do the geometry design. But kind of in my series, I'm just gonna call them menus because I think that's a little bit clearer of a term. So as I said before, Xfoil is just a hierarchy of menus. The top level gives you access to a handful of other menus, and then inside of those menus you might get access to a sub-menu. And each of these menus have commands. Now the commands are the actual code, so it's what's used to either change your data. If you have, say, an airfoil shape in the local memory that you loaded in, there might be some commands that you can use to change the airfoil shape or some properties of the airfoil, or it could be commands to perform certain tasks. We want to run an analysis of this airfoil at 5 degrees of angle of attack. So you would use certain commands to perform that task or that routine. So that's kind of how. So this is kind of how Xfoil and kind of generally how software works. You have the local memory, which has data in it, and you can use commands that would manipulate that data or retrieve it or store it into stored files. And menus are kind of an organizational structure for that code or that command. The next couple slides are going to talk about the data flow that happens in Xfoil. So earlier when I mentioned that we were going to discuss some of the interaction between the pieces of Xfoil, we're gonna go ahead and do that here, but we're gonna look at it from a perspective of how data is passed between objects or stored in objects, just kind of how they hand it off to each other. This will kind of help you understand how they interact with each other and what's going on in Xfoil to give you that kind of big picture. For reference, go ahead and look in the documentation that comes with Xfoil. You'll find some information on the data flow in there as well. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, of course, of all of the menus, all of the commands, all of the interactions, but rather it's going to cover the more popular ones, kind of what's typical or what's used the most. Starting right here with the airfoil data flow, a lot of how the data flows when you're dealing with some of the airfoils. Now, oftentimes when you're wanting to start an analysis of an airfoil, you already have the shape in mind, you know what the airfoil is. Xfoil has some NACA airfoils kind of stored inside of it, so you don't need any external files to load into Xfoil to load in the airfoil, but oftentimes you will need to take an airfoil coordinate file and load it into Xfoil. And we'll have a video in the future about that as well. But pretty much the way Xfoil works is that when you start Xfoil, it doesn't have any airfoil loaded half the time in its local memory. So what you need to do is you're going to have to pretty much tell Xfoil what airfoil you're using, right? Xfoil is a kind of one airfoil at a time type of a thing. So you need to load the airfoil that you're wanting to either analyze or manipulate. So that's kind of what some of these commands that you see here do. Now, the 4 commands there that you see, the Naka, the load, into, and save, these are all on the top level menu. And these are what's kind of used when you are dealing with the airfoil that is saved in the local memory. So, like I mentioned, Xfoil has some Naka airfoils built in, and that's what the Naka command is for. So you can specify what Naka airfoil you will have, and it will automatically load that into both the buffer and the current airfoil local memory. Those are actually 2 different memories location. Those are 2 different airfoils in memory. Now, what's nice about both Naka and load commands is that when you use those commands, it loads the same airfoil into both the buffer airfoil and the current airfoil. Now, the idea behind this is that if you're wanting to maybe tweak some of the geometry or the shape of the airfoil, you have this buffer airfoil where you can go ahead and tweak some of the objects in, and then you can make that your kind of push out and make it your current airfoil if you're satisfied with the results. So that's kind of the general idea behind the buffer airfoil and the current airfoil, is that this buffer airfoil gives you the option to kind of modify it and determine whether you want to keep it or not. And so the menu GDES is what you would type into the command line prompt to get to this menu. That menu it stands for, I guess that those letters stand for geometric design routine. So this is not geometric, sorry, geometry design routine. So that's the menu that's going to have a lot of the commands for changing the geometry of the airfoil, and it's also going to have some of the commands for moving data back and forth between this buffer airfoil and the current airfoil, as well as some of the commands that you need to modify that, some of the to modify the shape of the airfoil and the buffer airfoil. And of course, you see on the top level there's some other commands that you have. For instance, there's a save option, so if you manipulate an airfoil to a certain shape that you want, you can save it out to its own coordinate file that you can then load it back into Xfoil to do some more analysis on, or you can use that to load into other software, like maybe a CAD if you're trying to do a model, or so you got that option where you can save out an airfoil coordinate file. And the INTE command you see there is the interpolate. In an earlier video, I mentioned how you can actually create a new airfoil by blending different airfoils, and that's kind of what that command is for. Is you can take an airfoil coordinate file and a current airfoil, the airfoil and the current airfoil memory, local memory, and you can use this integrate command to kind of merge or blend the 2 airfoils, and it spits it out right there in the buffer airfoil for you to either continue manipulating or whatnot. So that's some of the basic, pretty common commands with dealing with the airfoils in Xfoil. Now we're actually going to have some tutorials later on in a couple videos. Actually, we're going to start doing some tutorials that'll run through each of these commands. So it'll kind of run you through step by step. What do you type in? What does each command exactly mean? how do I use the buffer airfoil, how do I use the current airfoil. So we'll have some tutorials here in the near future and a couple videos just right down the pipeline that'll kind of help you learn some of this and dealing with this this menu that you see here, the geometry design menu. On this slide, we're going to talk about the data flow in Xfoil for performing analysis or trying to determine some of the polars, the drag polars of a particular airfoil shape. Right, so at this point you should already have an airfoil in the memory, the local memory. Right, we kind of talked about that a little bit on the last slide, where you should have used either the load command to put to use an airfoil coordinate file and load an airfoil shape into Xfoil from a file, or the knocker command if you're wanting to use some of the built-in airfoils. So at this point there should already be an airfoil in the current airfoil memory. And the idea behind this menu is that you have the airfoil shape and you're wanting to analyze it, right? You might want to change some of the conditions of the airfoil, right? You might want to change the angle of attack that it's at, or you might want to change some of the flow conditions, right? Maybe you're wanting to do a viscous analysis instead of an inviscid analysis, or you're wanting to change some of the other flow conditions. You might this menu is what's going to have the commands to do that, right? It's going to have commands to change flow conditions, you know, Reynolds number. You might it also gives you the ability to change and perform analysis on the airfoil shape, right? So like we see here, there's that alpha command. You can specify, you know, I want to know the drag polar at 5 degrees angle of attack, or you can specify a sequence of alphas, right? I want to know from -1 degree to 10 degrees in 1 degree increments, so you can do a sequence of alphas, angle of attacks, and kind of get the drag polars from that. So that's kind of the idea behind this opera menu. To get to this, of course, if you're on the top level, you just on the command line type in OPER and hit enter, and that you'll notice that you'll drop down into the opera menu. If you look to the left of the caret at the command line prompt, you'll see what menu you're in. So you'll just see the OPER and you'll know you're in this menu. And this menu is just here for performing a lot of the tasks that you need to do when you're trying to analyze the shape. Now, of course, there's some other interaction between pieces, because after you perform an analysis, the data, the results of that analysis are also stored off in local memory, in the polar data memory, or kind of this surface speed memory. And there's some other functionality there, right? You can save off this polar data to a file on your computer. You can load it back in from a file on your computer. So that's kind of some of the options you have with the results of an analysis. It's not just there in Xfoil in the local memory and it will be wiped when you close Xfoil. You can actually have it saved off into a file. And of course, when you're doing some of the analysis, it also saves some of this memory off into like a surface speed, which is going to be used on the next slide. On the previous slide, we talked about performing an analysis on a known airfoil shape, right? You know your airfoil, you specify flow conditions, and you determine the performance. On this slide, we're pretty much trying to do the opposite. We know the performance, right? We know what surface speed distribution we want, and And so we're trying to back solve for the airfoil shape that would generate our desired surface speed distribution. So Xfoil has at least has a couple different methods for doing this. I believe in an earlier video I talked about that, how it has a fully inverse design function and then a partial inverse design function as well. So that's kind of what these two menus are. Right here you see, and you'll notice that the commands are pretty similar based on of the two menus are pretty similar. Right, so you've got this MDES and the QDES. DES, of course, is standing for design. So the MDES is the mapping design routine, or the complex mapping design routine. So that's going to be the menu that has a lot of commands for performing the fully inverse design of the airfoil based on what kind of surface speed distribution you want. It's also going to have some commands that you see down there to maybe modify and adjust the surface speed distribution. And the QDES is pretty similar, right? It's the surface speed design routine. The idea, of course, being is that you have the surface speed distribution that you want, and you're going to back solve for the airfoil that you need to do that to get that. So these are kind of the menus and commands that are used to kind of go between for instance, the surface speed data from the previous slide in here with QSet into this surface speed distribution memory location that you can modify and tweak, and then use that to try and determine airfoil shape. So that's kind of what's going on there in these different menus. They're of course available from the top level. So if you type in MDES or QDES at the command line prompt on the top level and hit enter, then you'll enter into one of these two menus, and you can use the commands to perform this design of an airfoil. And we'll of course cover this in a future video, you know, the difference between the two methods, which one's preferred, how they work, what kind of commands you want to use, and but you know, that'll be in a future video. But speaking of future video, I think we're going to go ahead and stop this video here. In this video we started kind of with a brief overview of what Xfoil is. Then we talked about some of the basic pieces that make up Xfoil. Right, you remember we have the local memory, the stored files, you have these menus, and then commands, right? The menus just hold a bunch of commands in them. Commands allow you to manipulate data. Local memory is the data that's currently stored and being manipulated, and then stored files where you can store away some of the data you want to save for a later date. And then we went into some of the data flow in Xfoil, kind of how the different airfoil pieces work together between the memories and the commands and the menus. We also talked about on the last slide how a lot of the analysis stuff works, and then on this slide how some of the design stuff works. So hopefully this video was very useful to you in terms of giving you that big picture overview of Xfoil, all of its pieces, how it all works together, and kind of helps you understand maybe a little bit better in terms of if you're wanting to do a particular task on how you can potentially get to that task and perform it, and what menu you might need to go to. You know, maybe, you know, if I'm wanting to perform an change the geometry of an airfoil, then I might need to go look at that geometry design menu, GDES. yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. If the series has been helpful, definitely show your support for the channel. You know, like the video, comment below, subscribe, share it with your friends. You know, maybe you're in an Aero 101 course and you have a project or an assignment where you need to use Xfoil to do something, and you found this to be really helpful. This series, this video, this channel, maybe you found it to be very useful to you. If you did, go ahead and share it with someone else right there, your classmate, maybe with some of your group members. The idea is that this series is made for you, and if you want to see anything in particular covered, or maybe I went kind of glossed over a little bit too much on something else, you want something more in depth, you know, feel free to let me know in the comments below. In the next video, we are going to kind of go over navigating through the different menus, right? From at the command prompt, how do you get to the lower level menus? How do you get to the higher level menus? How do I find out what commands are available at each menu level? How do I know what commands are going to require more information of me, what isn't? So that's kind of what's going to be covered in the next video. So go ahead and like the video, subscribe, comment below, and then when you've done all that, your next assignment is to click the link on the next slide that says watch the next video. It should be available in a couple days. But until that time, I will see you in the next video.